Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to share with you my guest today, who is Michael Rubino, author of The Mold Medic, president of All American Restoration, and an international mold remediation expert with nearly a decade of field experience working with individuals to improve the air quality in their homes. Today's episode is quite a personal one, as I recently found out that I had mycotoxin exposure from mold that I had been exposed to while staying in a water-damaged building. In the past year, I started experiencing an onset of a headache that I wasn't able to shake for nearly a whole year. I had worked with different people in the natural and conventional world, and by chance, which I'll share more about later in the conversation, I found out that I should have been actually looking to potential mold exposure. It hadn't occurred to me that one of the culprits of my symptoms was my very own environment, and I found it hard to fathom how something I barely gave any passing thought could cause the effects that I had felt, and how quickly they went away after I removed myself from the environment. So, this led me down a deep rabbit hole of research and speaking to some of the leading experts in this field of mold and environmental toxins. And this one today is a really special guest in the world of mold remediation. He has a decade of field experience and uses some of the most cutting-edge techniques available today. From working with people after Hurricane Sandy to his work and journey with helping extremely sensitive individuals. Michael has a really unique background because of his background growing up being closely connected to the construction industry. It gives him a deep understanding of not only building practices, but also how building practices today can affect mold growth inside your home. We talk about how we are not necessarily safer from mold just because you are buying a brand new property. We talk about what are some of the different symptoms of mold, how some of his clients had a change in their accent after being exposed to mold, and how specific genes such as the HLA-DR gene, which is currently estimated around 25% of the population in the US are a carrier of this gene. It essentially means that genetically, it can be more difficult for the body to detect and eliminate biotoxins from mold and environmental toxins. It has been said that because mold toxins are lipophilic, meaning that their molecular structure consists of fatty acid molecules. For this reason, mold toxins can migrate to and deposit in the brain, as the brain is one of the fattiest organs. We also chat about how EMF has been shown to cause mold to grow at a much more rapid rate and also potentially even produce more poisonous types of mycotoxins as well. So, without further ado, we dive right into the conversation, and I hope you enjoy the episode. All resources mentioned will be available in the show notes as well.
So I would say that I think COVID has actually created a bigger awareness that something that we can't necessarily see can impact our health. And so it's really helped change the conversation of, hey, we really have to be concerned about our air quality, right? Because what does COVID mainly transmit through the air, right? So when we look at that and we say air quality is an important factor, because it's not just mold, right? It's bacteria, it's viruses, it's toxins, pathogens. We have to be more concerned about our air quality. And I think COVID's really helped shine a light on that. So a silver lining, if you will, not that I would consider anything a silver lining with COVID, but I think it's at least got us to the forefront of the conversation of, hey, look, air quality is very, very important.
After reading, doing research into all the work that you're doing and experiencing what I have experienced in the past year. And I consider myself, still lucky because the reason why, this is my first episode as well on mold that we're doing for the podcast. But it's, I think, one of the really, not that the other episodes are not meaningful, but having firsthand experienced the effect that mold can actually have on your body. If you told me this a few months ago, I came from Australia, which is so dry. I came from Melbourne.
Right.
Like mold. I was like, oh, okay, maybe in my bread. Like that was as far as my knowledge really extended. And so if you told me that mold can cause the health effects that I had experienced, it would be so hard for me to believe. So what I had experienced last year, coming to Hong Kong was that, so I moved into a new place. I'm sure you hear this a lot, where it's, a property I thought was great, relatively quiet. And, but after I moved in, I started having an onset of headaches. And I could not shake the headaches. And I started having anxiety, just all these host of symptoms together. And so I'm also a certified health coach. So I'm generally, I try to be quite healthy, but I couldn't get myself back to that feeling of feeling normal. And so I went to see specialists. I had a headache on one side of my head. So on the left side, I saw all these different specialists. And the answer that I had got was that, oh, it must be stress, because everything came back normal. And so they told me to decrease my stress levels. And so,
isn't that so simple? Just flip the light switch, turn your stress off.
I tried, actually. So I tried to do yoga. I tried meditation. Tried quite a lot to deal with my stress. And by chance, I was working with a naturopath. And so I was actually seeing a feng shui master. So how I found out is quite funny. So I was seeing a feng shui master. And the feng shui master said to me, I think the feng shui in your house is off. And for me, I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And so I shared that story with the naturopath, and she said to me, have you checked for mold?
Wow.
And so this was, a year later after staying in this property. And it took a second for me to register. I was like, mold?
Was this in Hong Kong?
Yeah. So this was in Hong Kong last month.
Awesome.
Yeah. So just a month ago, after, staying in that house for close to a year. And so I'm like, no, I have not checked for mold. And then so I go into the bedroom and I find mold around the windowsills inside. And then I find it in the bathroom. And so that's kind of as far as I looked. And fortunately I was able to get myself out of there first. And so I had a whole year of headaches. And then within 3 weeks, the headache that never went away just went away.
Wow.
And so, it's, so here I am now, doing this, I think, really personal and really important episode for me.
I love hearing these stories, and you're right. I hear them every day, multiple times a day. But you know what? It's really empowering to know that you're not alone. And even though you may not know it, I know it because of the amount of people that I speak to every day. And it's really powerful for me. And it validates that what I'm doing is very important. And, it's interesting because where we're at, I kind of look at it like this cigarette phase. If you've paid attention to cigarettes, back in the day, everyone smoked cigarettes, right? And 50 years later, they're like, cigarettes are bad, right? It took 50 years to really formulate that cigarettes were not healthy. They were not good for our body. And I feel like we're in the mold phase of things. I feel like we're 20 years in. We still have another 30 years to go. Wow. Because we have that niche that understands, that knows that mold exposure is not great for our bodies. We have that, but it's far and few between. Like how long did it take for you to figure out that mold was the actual problem, right? Think about that. And 1 year. And how many professionals did you go to?
I think around 5.
You went through 5 professional people before someone said, have you checked for mold? And actually, it makes me feel really happy because I never know what things are like globally. I get calls from clients, mostly in Europe, internationally. I haven't gotten a call in Asia. So thank you for being the first. This is amazing. And to hear that there was a functional medicine doctor in Hong Kong that had the wherewithal to know that mold could be a potential problem, it makes me feel really good, because now I understand that this is something that is being educated on a global level, which is something that I always feared for, because when I start looking at mold, and it may be spelled differently depending on where you're at in the world. And when you start looking at mold, and I'll just give in a quick example, Ireland, because it's on the top of my mind, but there's companies out there doing mold remediation in Ireland. And when I go to their websites and I'm looking into what they're doing and the techniques and things, I can tell that they're kind of where we were at in America 20 years ago. Like they're still doing older techniques that are not necessarily going to work for someone who is sensitive. And so when I see that, and I'm just like, man, we are so far behind globally, and I have this company called All American Restoration, which is not going to work for international, but essentially what I'd like to do at some point is be able to train and certify people all across the world on the exact technology that I'm using today to help someone who is extremely sensitive to get back into their place. And I know what that looks like. And it's thorough. And it gets poo-pooed all the time. I am constantly told that I am over the top. But sometimes over the top is what we need, right? And when I hear that sentiment that I'm over the top, and I look at all the people that I've helped, and we're well over 1,000 at this point. Tell those 1,000 people that had nowhere else to go that I'm too over the top, because if I didn't exist, they probably would not be better right now. And so when I look at that, I say, you know what? We're not over the top. We're right where we need to be, and everybody else is lagging far behind. And I'm trying to really break that barrier so that we get wide acceptance of what we're doing. And it's very simple. It's when you look at mold and you look at mold remediation, it is mold the colony, right? So you have water intrusion or moisture intrusion. It allows for the opportunity for mold to grow. I always hear this term, mold is ubiquitous. There's nothing you can do. Yeah. And it's all hogwash. Yes, mold is ubiquitous, but no, it is not true that there is nothing you can do. When you have no opportunity for mold to grow, the mold that comes into your place is at such a low level. And now everyone argues, well, there's no real international standards on what's acceptable and what's not. Yeah. And I would say that may be true, but actually in the industry itself, there is a wide acceptance to say that if there is more mold inside than outside, you are exposed to higher levels in your own home, breathing the air that you breathe in your own home than you would if you were breathing the air outside. I think that's where the problem starts to happen, right? If you, for instance, let's say normally breathe in 100 mold spores every breath you take when you're outside, and it's going to be a different species typically than a water damaged species growing on the inside. And then you have 10,000 spores that you're breathing in with each breath inside. You would say that's a lot higher than outside. But you can have professionals that'll argue and say, well, there's no level of acceptance. And so that's kind of the battles that I have. And then the other battles are the whole medical community. As you mentioned, you went through 5 professionals before you found someone that agreed or that thought that mold could be the problem. And then you ended up finding mold, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not every professional. It's 1 out of 5. So if 20% of the professionals say mold's a problem, but 80% think that it's not, legally, where are we at? The balance is not there. So in a court of law, you're more likely to agree with the 80% that think mold is not a problem, rather than the 20% that think it is. It's not that the 80% is right, even though it's a majority. It's just that the 80% has not been educated. Mm-hmm. And it's mind-blowing to me because the average person takes 20,000 breaths per day. You're consuming more air, right, than anything else on the planet. More air is entering your body than water or food. Right. And if that air is toxic, it should be the first thing that we look at to diagnose
Yeah.
if you have a health problem. But instead, we do MRIs and all these other things to see what's your brain activity looking like, right? And I get it, but at the same time, why don't we start with air quality and then work our way to these other technical analysis, right? That's kind of really where I come from, and what I'm trying to do to create that awareness is saying, guys, look, sometimes the answer is staring right in front of you, but we go to these more complex things to try to diagnose the problem.
Yeah. So, I wanted to start by kind of asking, so when did we start kind of having this growing awareness around mold and its relation to health? Because mold has definitely been around for however long, way before humans have
Yes.
existed.
Sure.
So when did this awareness start to kind of come about?
For me or for society?
For society.
I'd say probably, from my research, at least in the United States anyway, it
Yeah.
really started becoming a general awareness in the 1980s
Okay.
that mold could impact the health. Obviously, we were aware of mold well before that.
Yeah.
I think even in the 1500s, you could dig up some articles regarding mold. But in the 1980s, I would say is the first time we started seeing doctors come out and say, I mean, even the EPA and the CDC, they jumped on the bandwagon and started diving into mold, right? Mm-hmm. Then that's really when things started to take that turn. You had in the 90s, unfortunately, the hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits happened here in the States against contractors, builders, insurance companies, home insurance companies that covered for damages like water loss. And whenever you have that type of litigation, typically somebody eventually says, we need to even the scales here. This isn't going to work, right? 2001, the CDC walks back the claims that mold impacts people's health. And what they do instead is they say mold impacts some people's health. It went from impacts people's health to impacts some people's health because some people may be allergic to mold. It changes the whole dynamic. So now the lawsuits stop. And with that, all the research stops, right? A lot of these government funded programs into researching mold and the effects of mold on people's health, all that goes away. And it's kind of like we were headed in the right direction and then took 10 steps back. And then now I would say in 2015, I really started to see people wake back up and start bringing back up and mold again. And it really came to me when I would say 2014, 2015 is right around when they started testing for gliotoxin in the home. And we were challenged with removing gliotoxin, which seemed to be the most stubborn of the mycotoxins to remove. And that's when we started experimenting with surfactants instead of, like a chemical like ammonia, for instance. And we started seeing that, wow, mycotoxins are really more like a chemical compound, than they are like the typical mold particle. So we had to switch to more of a chemical residue removal process in order to effectively remove it. And this is all like groundbreaking technology. Prior to us really breaking into this space, you really didn't see companies like these big national companies, or even these big global companies talking about mycotoxin removal from the home. It just didn't exist. So we really broke into this space and kind of helped develop the technologies that people are using today to remove mycotoxins from people's home. So it's very, very interesting, very, very unique. But I think, like I said, we are still at the infancy stage of where we need to be.
And so I read in your book that you started your, correct me if I'm wrong, field experience during Hurricane Sandy. I was wondering if you could share a bit more about that experience.
Yeah, so that diving into how I started getting into mold. Basically, since I'm 5 years old, my father has been a contractor, and being around construction my entire life, I would go to projects with him working on the summers. weekends, anytime he needed help, I was so gung ho to jump in his truck and hit the road and go check out these projects. And I asked a lot of questions. By the time I was in high school, I really knew buildings inside and out, and I loved it. After college, I decided to move back home, and I started working for my dad, and it was on the marketing side, and I was doing marketing and sales. And it was it was shortly after Hurricane Sandy had happened. So I'm going into people's homes, and I'm tasked with meeting with insurance adjusters to talk about, these situations. Not on top of mold remediation, there was also this fire restoration, which was probably the main battery of business that my father's company did. And so even in those situations, obviously, when you have a fire, they're using water to put it out. You're going to have water damage as a result. Mm-hmm. So I'm getting hit with this on both sides. We have water damage from Sandy. You have water damage from fires. And these insurance adjusters' mentality was just kind of like, you rip it out. You don't need all that engineering controls. You could paint over it. It was very like mold isn't a big deal.
Yeah.
And it didn't make sense to me because I saw it. It was a living, breathing, organism growing and everything, right? It isn't something you just paint over. It's just going to grow right through it. And I knew when I started researching that I just figured this is not right? Something didn't sit well with me. And I didn't want to work in a company where we had to do things that weren't proper. And my dad didn't like it either. But at the end of the day, the insurance company is the one who writes the checks. They're typically the ones that make the decisions. So you have to literally fight with them tooth and nail to do the right thing by the client, which is exhausting, by the way. Mm-hmm. And, it got to this point where I started seeing that not only are people not wanting to do things the right way, and it wasn't the main problem was not only the insurance companies dictating it, but the fact that the other 50,000 restoration companies out there were following the direction. Because at the end of the day, there was all these companies exist to make money, right? And I'm not saying all of them, but most of them, I don't think they really knew what they were doing. They were just happy to do whatever the insurance company asked of them and to collect that check at the end of the day. Yeah. And I started seeing people getting sick. And this is when it really started to drive me nuts, because I would go into people's houses, and this is from Sandy to 7 years thereafter. Mm-hmm. I'm walking into people's houses who are sick, and they already had remediation done. And when I'm going through this report where all the mold is located, and I'm asking the client, where was your home remediated? And they're pointing out all the areas that now needed to be re-remediated long after they were supposedly already completed. So, and they were getting sick because of it. So I started, getting emotional over this, because it wasn't just one person. It wasn't a fluke. It was a lot of people. I mean, right after Hurricane Sandy finished, for 7 years thereafter, I was remediating homes that were already remediated, and a lot of them, hundreds of them. So I started really saying there's a problem here that needs to be solved. And I started looking into why is one remediation company different from another? Shouldn't it just be a normal thing? Like if you get your house painted, yes, one company may paint better than the other, but at the end of the day, you can expect that your house will be painted, right? Yeah. With mold remediation, it's not that way. Even though there's some guidelines, I don't want to call them standards because I want to call them really guidelines. There's some guidelines. The guidelines are not enough for one company to do the same thing as another company. A lot of it is human interpretation. And from what I see...
Sorry to interrupt, but in your book, how many hours does it take to, study to kind of graduate?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So in the United States, and this holds true for pretty much every state except Texas right now. Mm-hmm. Texas is 5 days of 8-hour classes, 40 hours. But most states, like New York, for instance, it's a 3-day class. So in 3 8-hour days, 24 hours, you are now considered a mold professional.
Has that changed much over the years, or, it's been like this for the past X amount of years?
Well, the only thing that's changed over the years is the fact that you need to be licensed at all, because New York State. I want to say it was 2017 that they just created the first mold license. So prior to that, you could remediate homes in New York without needing a license.
Wow.
So you needed no experience.
Okay. Could you talk a bit more about, in your book, you mentioned this difference between being called, the Mercedes versus the Honda.
Yeah. So kind of what I was getting into, right, is the fact that, there's no standards. So everybody's going to do things a little bit different. And I want to tell this story that's in my book because it's really powerful. There's a client that we had done work for. She had a second house, and we were just north of the second house. And she figured, you know what, it would probably just be cheaper to hire a local company to do it, or I don't really know the full reasoning behind it. Maybe she didn't think that we would come down there for her, make the drive. And at that point, we were pretty small. We're only about 5 or 6 people in the company. We're a small company located in New Jersey ourselves. They hired this local company, and she felt comfortable because the gentleman had 35 years of experience in mold remediation.
Which is a lot. Yeah.
Which is a lot, right? And so you would think that if somebody's been doing it for 35 years, they know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. Well, she found out, sadly, that she was mistaken in that front. When they got the post-inspection done, the place still had mold everywhere. So whatever he remediated did not work. And at that point, I was asked to, please drive down and meet with him and take a look and just help get back on track. And I was happy to do so. And I will literally never forget this because it's just such an amazing story. And it just kind of showcases how far off we are. I'm sitting down at the kitchen table with the client after I did the walkthrough and what would happen. And I started asking the guy some honest questions like, hey, for treatment to work, you need to treat the whole space. Why did you just treat like one side of the 2x4? And I'll try to give you like a visual. So my hands are acting as a 2x4. You have the one side, the other side, you have the top side and the bottom side, right? So just for sake of this story, he only treated the bottom side right here of the 2x4. And so the sides were completely untreated, unexposed. Not only that, but you could see brush marks all over the place. So for lack of a better term, it looked like, you had my 5-year-old son go down there with a paintbrush and just start going like this. And I was just like, this just doesn't look professional at all. Right. And so I'm like, hey, why did you do it this way? This is not effective. This is why you failed, because you didn't treat the whole space. You just went in there and treated the underside of the beam. He's like, well, Michael, I've been doing this for 35 years. It's the way I've always done it. I've never had a problem before. I'm like, well, did you ever test before? Did you ever test your own work before? Well, no. Well, then, so how did you know it wasn't a problem before? Well, I guess I don't know, but I've been doing it for 35 years. Like, okay, is it possible that you've been doing it wrong for 35 years? Right? I mean, is that not a possibility? He's like, well, no, I think this usually works for most people. I think this client is sensitive, and you're like the Honda, I'm like the Honda of mold remediation, and Michael, you're like the Mercedes of mold remediation. And really what this client needed was a Mercedes, not a Honda. And I was like, wow. Well, can I ask you a question? Shouldn't everyone get the Mercedes then if the Honda may not work? Like that was kind of the rational and logic that I was having. It's like, well, so in this scenario, the Honda may not get you where you're trying to go. And you have to roll the dice on getting that Honda and hoping that there's enough gas in the tank to get you where you need to go. Then why get the Honda at all, right? And that was kind of my questioning. And it just kind of showcases this is really far off from where we need to be. And it's not difficult. Like it's very elementary. It's a very elementary science. And just a couple more steps than what we've been taught that needs to be done is all that we need to add to it.
So that client, were they surely they were experiencing some symptoms. That's why they, called
Yes.
you guys to come back and help her out, right?
Yeah. Yeah, she was experiencing brain fog, chronic fatigue, allergy-like symptoms. She would just say, I can't even think straight. I just need help, right? And that's what she had called upon for me to come down there. And, after sitting with the guy and explaining to him, he just kind of bowed out and said, I don't think I'm a good fit here.
Mm.
And it was like, I don't think you're a good fit anywhere with that kind of mentality or that kind of attitude. I think, I didn't always know everything, right? I became obsessed with trying to figure everything out. And I mean, there was a ton of trial and error to get to where I'm at today. But I wanted to learn. I wanted to be better and do better and accomplish things that, when people would say, I'm so sensitive that I have to leave my home, I could never live there again. I was like, how could that be possible? Right? If something didn't exist in your home, and then after something occurs, it now exists in your home, to say that it's impossible to remove it, it just doesn't seem plausible to me. And I now know that it's not true. It can be removed.
Yeah. And, it seems that sometimes it's because if the person is not showing really drastic symptoms, sometimes it can be hard for them to, link the two together. But I was
Yeah.
speaking with my naturopath and she was saying that, she was working with this family. And so the parents thought that they had, they were experiencing most of the symptoms and they thought that their child was fine. And so they remediated the house. But after they remediated the house, their child's grades, everything just improved exponentially.
Wow.
So, this family thought that their child wasn't even affected until they did the remediation. And, that's the answer that they did get.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's really cool. Because you know what? I usually have two types of clients. One, they can know instantly that there's mold, right? They can't even be within 10 feet of their front door. But
Yeah.
then you have the clients that have like woken up one day and they're like, I feel horrible, right? And it's like, well, when did you start feeling horrible? And they're like, I don't know. It just happened ever so slightly. And I guess it probably took a period of 6 months before I started not feeling well
Mm.
and linked it to mold. So for some people, it could happen instantly. And for some people, it could be such a slow degradation of their health that they don't realize until months later.
Mm. And so I wanted to ask a bit more about, the genetic front. And so, um, there's a particular gene, right, that makes people more susceptible to mold.
Yeah. So the HLA-DR gene,
Mm.
if you're a carrier of that gene, your body doesn't methylate properly.
Okay.
And so detoxifying is basically non-existent. Essentially, most of us, they detoxify through the liver, right? And you excrete any toxins out of your body. With a carrier of the HLA-DR gene, that is not happening the way it does for everybody else. And by the way, it's estimated that the carrier of the HLA-DR gene is somewhere around 25 to 33% of the population. So that's a lot of people
Yeah.
that are potentially carriers of this gene that are not detoxifying properly. And this can really create a lot of complications, not just with mold, right? It's bacteria, it's viruses, it's anything that is going to impact your immune system, shut it down, and allow all these other things to occur. It's kind of like AIDS and HIV, right? You don't actually die from AIDS or HIV. You die from the common cold because of the way your immune system shuts down from AIDS or HIV. It's very similar in that regard, where when you're not detoxifying properly, your body gets overloaded.
Mm.
The amount of inflammation that starts to occur within your organs is detrimental to your health. And that's when you really start to see people extremely sick, bedridden. I've seen clients eating from a feeding tube, very, very scary stuff. And so you have to physically get tested to see if you are a carrier of that gene. And, if mold is an impact for you, I think it's always important to see, because you would definitely want a different treatment program if you're a carrier of the gene versus if you're not.
Mm. And it's interesting. when I was speaking to my naturopath, they were saying that the testing to do it in Hong Kong is actually very expensive. And a lot of the time they have to send the testing actually back to labs in the States.
Yeah.
And then, get the results. So I think also the accessibility of the testing is also, an issue as well.
Yeah, I've been hearing that. I was talking to a woman in London, and she was saying that not only did she not really have a lot of good mold inspectors in London that did perform the types of testing of the home that she became familiar with, but also the fact that they have to send it from the UK to the US because most of those labs are in the US. Now, the only testing center that I know of that we actually outsource to Europe would be the epigenetics testing being outsourced to Germany. But I agree. I think, for this to work globally, we need a lot more testing laboratories as well as professionals that know to use certain types of testing from those labs to diagnose problems for people, whether it's in their body, in their home, et cetera.
So another really important thing I wanted to talk about, which I think also with your expertise in the construction front, was the importance of building practices. So are we seeing an issue with our modern building practices that may be causing also more greater issue when it comes to mold, and also how it might look like when it comes to apartments, especially for those who live in Asia? Most of the time when I'm in Asia, I'm mostly staying in an apartment.
Sure. Yeah. So, we've definitely, I speak for the United States on this, but we've definitely headed in the wrong direction. Building practices are getting worse and worse from an environmental standpoint. From an energy code standpoint, yes. We have almost net zero energy efficiency. However, there comes a great risk with that. And let me talk about a couple different things, because I think this is a problem everywhere. But we're using this polyethylene spray foam. I don't know how popular that is in Hong Kong. However, in the United States, what it does, it basically seals the entire building in. There's pros like energy efficiency. Temperature differentials pretty much don't exist. The cons are two major cons. One, if it's applied improperly, it doesn't work and it causes actually adverse reactions to it. The second thing, even if it is applied properly, if you have any weakness in that building envelope and water does get in, it now no longer comes in naturally. And what I mean by that is if you have a roof leak, you have your roof here, let's say water comes in here, there's going to be a wall structure here that it's just going to come down. It's going to be visible somewhere in that wall structure that there's a leak. Now you can open it up, dry it out, it kind of trace it up and realize that your roof is leaking. You resolve the problem, you dry it out, remediate if needed, and you're done. With the spray foam system, you have spray foam basically going up the whole outside of the house is being completely enclosed with the spray foam. So if you have water coming in, it's basically traveling down this envelope here. It doesn't have a wall system interior to travel down. It's going to be traveling down the exterior. Now, what that does is it traps moisture in between the wood substrate and the spray foam itself. So you're going to get wood rot where it's going to, damage the structure of the material much faster than it would because it's not drying the way it normally would, because it's literally smothering the breathability. If we're going to build with wood and we smother it when it needs to breathe, it's not able to do that. It's only breathing on the top side of it, but not really even then because you're smothering it with other products as well. So you have this complexity of layers now that are not able to dry the way that they're supposed to dry. Also, with the fact that there's leaking, you're going to have a lot more surface area to cover in terms of potential mold damage. And again, back to that, if it's not applied properly, you will have air gaps where now that mold can intrude back into the living space. And I've seen it time and time again. I can't tell you how many projects we've had to remove the spray foam in order to remediate properly. And the problem there is it's not cheap to do that because to get at that spray foam, you don't just need it to be somewhat gone. You need to literally scrape it away from the wood so that you can remove the mold growing into the wood, which is going to be fully behind it. So it is very, very costly and difficult to deal with. And one of the things that I think that nobody thought of when they started using and pushing this product. The other thing is we buy a lot of materials that are made that are not made the same way that they used to be. For instance, we used to mill lumber from trees. It was actually rough. And we used to build houses with that. Now we basically have these products that have a lot of glues, and you're literally gluing together subgrade wood products and making lumber materials out of it. And we're building houses with that. It's not true traditional lumber anymore. And what's happening is that lumber is a lot more porous because it has a lot more layers in there. And what that's doing is it's allowing, again, water damage to impact the space. And so, the solution is always, we'll prevent water damage. Well, water damage is not forever. Preventing water damage doesn't work forever. Products do deteriorate over time. You do have conditions where products expand and contract based upon temperature changes. You're going to have things decay. The actual statistic is once out of every 10 years, a house has some sort of water event. So we should be operating off of that statistic and saying, well, if a house every 10 years has a water damage event, we should be building our homes in a way where when that does happen, we can handle it quickly and easily. I'm now seeing even newer construction than what we were seeing after the last 20 years, where they're building wall assemblies with like 6 different layers, where literally a wall assembly in the United States is going to be a foot in width with all these different components. That's unfortunately, again, another step in the wrong direction, because when water does impact the space, and it will, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be costly to get into the layers to remediate properly. And quite frankly, whenever something is more difficult, what ends up happening is corners get cut because somebody is like, that's a lot. And insurance companies certainly are not going to want to pay to do things the right way and get back into the layers. So what's going to end up happening is we're going to start ignoring things and basically making it that, mold's not going to be a problem here. And in my opinion, that's definitely heading the wrong direction again.
For example, the one with the 6 layers, why is that being introduced more and more?
Because we're so focused on energy, on conserving energy. We're so focused on not allowing, with energy, we talk about 2 things, right? We want to be so insulated that it's a totally different climate inside our house than outside of our house, so that we barely need any air conditioning or barely need any heat, right? And with that, we're saving on energy costs. And I am a huge advocate for the environment, but at the same time, there has to be a smart way to get there. We can dive into a whole different conversation. Trying to build this way to conserve on energy within our homes is probably not the best use of our time or resources, is not going to accomplish the kind of energy savings than if we were to do things elsewhere, such as electric cars, solar panels, solar powered, roads, roofs, things like that. I think we're focusing too much on tripping over the pennies, tripping over the dollars to pick up pennies in that regard. So it's an unfortunate scenario, but that's kind of the way, that's the justification that they're heading that way. And again, I'm all for doing everything we can, but let's do it in a way where we're not sacrificing air quality as a result.
Yeah. So when I was previously looking for apartments in Hong Kong, I was trying to look for ones that were more new. Am I right to say that just because it's new does not mean I'm necessarily safe from mold?
You're unfortunately right. New does not mean safe. If you've done some research about me, you may know that I'm in litigation with my builder who is building me a brand new home. Unfortunately, there was a ton of mold that was found throughout the new construction process. Just to be factually correct here, we're talking 1.5 million spores per half a square inch. It's a lot. If you were to measure the entire space entirely, I have no idea. Probably in the billions or trillions of mold spores present. But with that being said, you have to be careful whether it's new or old. I think even when it's new, you should be doing some sort of testing to see if there's an environmental impact. I'll give you some examples. When a house is being built, or a building too, it's going to sit in the elements at some period of time as they're building it, before it's officially considered dried in. Dried in meaning the exterior of the envelope is closed up, the windows and doors are in, right? There is a minimal exchange of air from outside to inside at that point. And when it rains, it's not raining inside the building anymore. That's what dried in means. Now, when a building is dried in, everywhere across the globe, we should then be dehumidifying the space to make sure whatever porous or semi-porous materials, depending on whether it's concrete or lumber, in both scenarios, you'd want to make sure it's getting drier before you start introducing porous building materials like insulation or drywall. So that's a step that we should be doing. And I guarantee you some companies are, but I would say most are not. The other thing we should be doing is we should be testing our structures to make sure that there isn't an active mold colony somewhere. And if there is, you treat it and remove it, so that, again, before you introduce insulation and drywall, you now have a pretty good bearing that there's going to be a good air quality when you're done. Building over mold is not the solution, but it's unfortunately what does happen. And there's two things. One, there's a lack of knowledge in the construction industry regarding mold. The second thing is there's probably some greed somewhere in there. Like, I don't want to have to do all those steps because it'll cost more money. Right? So you have both factors in that regard. Living in an apartment, as you mentioned, I realized I forgot to answer this before. Living in an apartment in general is difficult, especially if you are sensitive to mold, because now you have, let's say a building has 100 different units in it. Yeah. You're essentially breathing the same air as 100 different people are. Now, if there's a leak on the 94th floor in apartment A, it can impact the person in the 86th floor in apartment D. Right? Because there is some commonality with sharing air quality. Of course, the further away from the situation you get, the more diluted that's going to be, that concentration. But still, you're going to have some exchange throughout, the time that you're there of other units. So it's very, very difficult to live in a building if you're sensitive. And I deal with that a lot. And so when I have clients who are sensitive that just they want to be in New York City, for instance. Yeah. What we do is we remediate their unit. We try as best as possible, it's not perfect, to seal their unit from the other units. And we try to, introduce some air purification devices into the space so that they're constantly filtering their air, just the way just as similar as the way we filter our water before we drink it.
So what do you mean by like sealing it off? And full disclosure, I really don't understand, this topic much at all. And so can't you just open the windows, if in the apartments, like how is it affecting, say, 86th floor to the 54th floor?
So a couple of different things. You have what's called chases in a building. What chases mean is there's piping systems for plumbing, and there's electrical systems, for everybody's lights to work. And they go inside of these chases that go from floor to floor, from apartment to apartment. Mm-hmm. So if you have a leak at the bottom floor, you're going to have these pipe chases that travel up the entire building that exchanges air from one unit to the next, especially considering air does naturally rise. Yeah. You're going to have just the air being, pressure pushing upwards, traveling throughout the unit. You're going to have people that have HVACs running that then circulate that air around, and it's going to push it into other units. You are going to have some exchange of air. Now, in that exact example, you're saying, can't they just open the windows? Absolutely. If you open the windows, you're going to be circulating fresh air in and out. Now, if you have a mold problem in your unit and you open the windows, you definitely will dilute that mold in the air that you're breathing, but it's still going to be there. It's still going to be creating mold spores that are getting aerosolized. It could be potentially a mycotoxin producing mold that's producing toxins that can impact your body. So it's not just enough to open the window and think that you're avoiding the problem. You have to deal with the problem. And then, you'll start to notice a difference in the air quality thereafter. But yeah, unfortunately, with that exchange of air, everybody's HVAC systems, a home or a building really being a breathing system that exchanges air, you're unfortunately never going to be able to get away from that. And when I mentioned sealing the units, it's actually, you have these chases where the pipes will protrude from the floor. And there's usually a gap around those pipes where air could exchange. Maybe small gaps, but sealing those off, it's not perfect, but it does help. It does help with that air exchange from other units from the building. So that's kind of the strategy we employ to just slow the exposure rate to that unit.
And so what about your HVAC filtering system?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the lungs of your home. So it's so important to filtrate the HVAC system. There's a product that I like. It's called HealthWay Super V. The reason I like it so much is because it has the ability to filter out particles as small as 7 nanometers. That's really tiny. That's about the size of a virus in comparison to, mold being, 2 decimal points higher in size. So if you could filter out particles that small, that mold is not going to be a problem. Why it's so important is because as mold spores, if you look at them like seeds, where weeds produce seeds, especially if you have some yards and greenery, that a weed can kind of destroy your yard or your green space pretty quickly. Mainly because its ability to produce seeds that get aerosolized, they get into the soil, it rains, the soil gets wet, the seeds then start to grow into more weeds. So mold is very similar in that regard, in where you have a living organism producing spores, they're called. They get aerosolized. When they get into the HVAC, the HVAC system has what's called a coil that constantly condensates. So when that spore happens to land on that coil, it has the ability to then grow and colonize. And now that HVAC system becomes a mold factory of its own, if you will. And so the HVAC system can become very problematic if you don't protect it properly. And so filtration with the HVAC system, it solves 2 problems. 1, it filters the air inside the unit you're breathing. And 2, it protects the coil from contamination from mold.
Okay, great. I'll share the link to that as well in the show notes. And so I wanted to ask, for example, if I'm looking, or whether or not I'm living in this property at the moment, or I'm looking for a new property, how can I tell that, there's mold without, say, necessarily first doing testing? How can we tell there's mold in the property?
Cool. So I will give you 3 unique things that I think you can look for. The first is that coffee looking stain. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah.
When you have water damage, it turns like this coffee colored stain. If you see that coffee colored stain on your ceilings, your walls, it's evident that there's water or moisture intruding. And that's the catalyst for mold to start to grow. So if there's water, you want to identify if there's potentially mold. Even if it doesn't look like there's mold there, it doesn't mean it's not behind the wall or behind the ceiling. Okay. So you do want to double check. The second thing is when mold is present, you'll get this musty odor. It's produced by MVOCs, microbial VOCs. That's what that damp, wet smell smells like. If you experience that smell anywhere in your place, even if it's a basement, crawl space, if you happen to be in an apartment, anywhere in the apartment, it can happen. If you start to experience that smell, it's a good indicator that there's water intrusion and potentially mold as well. The third, which I love because it's a really cool visual trick, and I guarantee you anyone listening to this will probably pause to go check this out. But if you go over to your toilet, and if you have a toilet tank that's exposed, if you actually pull the lid off of that tank and you flip it over, you'll be able to see on the underside if there's mold growing, or when you look physically in the tank, if there's mold growing in there. That's indicative that there's mold somewhere in your place that's producing at such a high volume that the opportunity for it to transfer into that toilet tank is high. And so that's a sign that you need to start looking and inspecting to see if it's in your HVAC. Did you have a leak somewhere? Where is that source coming from? Because the source is not the toilet. It's somewhere else getting into the air that happened to land inside the toilet. So that's a good indicator as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. If, we find that there is mold in the property, what should we be looking for in a remediator?
Well, I think the first step you need to do is, even if you physically see mold, you want to still get a mold inspection done. Mm-hmm. And I know that's like, well, why? Well, a couple of different reasons. One, you want to make sure if you're going to have someone in your house, remediating, you want to make sure that they're getting everything, right? So if you have one mold problem that you can see, you want to make sure that there's nothing else there. So it definitely pays to get a mold inspection done. The other thing is, the mold, what may look like the size of a baseball may be massively much larger behind the wall itself. And so where you may think, if I cut out 2 feet, I'm good to go. Yeah. Testing might identify that, hey, no, actually you need to cut out like 8 feet. And so again, you don't want to get into a situation where you're remediating, you think you got it all and you miss a lot of it, right? And that'll still continue to impact potentially your health. So I think getting the inspection done is really, really crucial for that. Also, when you get the inspection done, they're going to give you a recommendation, almost like a blueprint of what you then need to do to remediate. So then you can take that recommendation and then interview with mold remediation companies. And so when a mold remediation company is like, I don't need to listen to that, I've been doing this forever, I'm going to do what I want to do, that's a red flag that they may not be a good fit, because what they might want to do doesn't necessarily mean it's going to solve your problem. Mm-hmm. And so the other questions to ask the remediation company is just kind of like, what sort of guarantee do you offer? If you open up that wall and you remediate and we get the guy back in here to test and it still shows that there's mold present, are you going to come back and handle that? Or, what's the procedure there? Because really, if they set out to remediate something, they should honor that. And mold can be tricky because in its simplest form, it is microscopic. So you can't see it. And so you can fail even when you're really good. And you may have to come back and re-clean the area and just make sure it's removed properly. And that should be part of the process. It shouldn't just be this thing where, it's X amount of dollars. If I fail, I'm going to have to charge you another X amount of dollars to do it over again. So I think that there should be some fairness and some common ground built into the proposal. You also just want to make sure that if you're in an area that requires a license, that they're licensed to do so, that they have insurance so that, God forbid, they make a mistake, you're not responsible for paying for that mistake, that their insurance company will cover, things like that.
Okay, perfect. Got it. And so what about, for example, clothing? Like, what should we be doing with the clothing? Because so previously, before I had moved out of the property, I only took, I've been living in gym gear the past few weeks. So I left everything in the property. And so last week, I actually brought some of the clothing back into the room, which, by Hong Kong standards, the rooms are not big. And I noticed a little bit of symptoms coming back. So was that a bad idea?
Well, what I think you did is I think you just inadvertently brought some mold with you.
Yeah.
You started experiencing that symptom because you then exposed yourself to that mold. So I think that's what really had occurred. And honestly, you're not alone. I've heard that same story, unfortunately, multiple times. I think what the right thing to do is to clean those clothes before you bring them into the new space so that you know for sure that they're not going to potentially impact you. And even then, the best cleaner in the world is going to be 99.97% successful. So there's still that 0.03% chance that you don't, that you still feel an adverse reaction even after you clean it with a cleaner that is successful at removing mold or mycotoxins. So if you are the extremely sensitive person, which I have dealt with firsthand, you may want to clean things, see how you react around them, and then bring them into your new space, which can be challenging, but that may be what you need to do in introducing things slowly, little by little into the new space so that you can be sure that you can notate any change that you may feel and be able to pinpoint it to what was the cause of that change.
And so what kind of cleaning should we be doing or have you seen to have a higher success? For example, is it dry cleaning? Is it a particular brand that you know that has a high success rate?
Yeah, so I would say two products that I see people have success with. One is called borax. The other is called EC3 laundry additive.
Okay.
And what that laundry additive does is you follow the instructions on the back. They're fairly easy, but you're essentially putting it inside your washing machine with your clothes and just doing laundry with it. So you have that and borax. And I've had clients do both, like do the borax first, then the EC3 thereafter, and have success that way as well. You can try one, try both. There's probably other alternatives out there too, but those are the biggest common ones that I hear about.
Okay, great. And so I wanted to, start talking a bit more about for people who, unfortunately have been exposed to mold. What are some of the protocols that you've heard of or that you've seen more success with?
Step one is you have to remove yourself from the environment, right? Yeah. And typically when you need to do a remediation, you're not doing it while you're there anyway. So I would say the first thing you want to do is find a temporary place to live. Usually your problem is significant compared to some of the other problems, because I know it may be difficult to find a place to live that's 100% mold free, but you at least want to find a place that is significantly better than your current situation, that'll give you a better environment to start healing. It's like, I look at it like this, you can't heal no matter what program you're on if you're constantly exposing yourself to what's causing you adverse health reactions. It'd be like this. Imagine your tub is overflowing with water. It'd be like trying to take towels to clean up the water without first shutting off the faucet. You have to remove yourself from the environment, shut off the faucet, then allow your body to start to heal. So at that point, you're moving out, then you start your treatment protocol with the doctor, probably all while you're now planning to remediate at your place so that eventually you can get back in there. But in the meantime, at least you're now allowing yourself some space to heal.
Yeah. So for example, with myself, I'm doing, I think it's called the chlorostomine. I know that's a common one that people do. Are there being certain protocols that you have seen people have success with that we could share with the audience?
Yeah. So, I have seen things as elementary as changing your diet to an anti-inflammatory diet, removing foods or drinks that could contain mold, such as peanuts or coffee.
Okay.
And by switching to this anti-inflammatory diet, you're allowing because mold does cause inflammation. Wow. So you're reversing that effect of the inflammation, and that's going to jumpstart your body and allow yourself to start detoxing. I've seen people doing things like, what's the right term? Colon hydrotherapy, where they're literally, cleansing out their colon by means of water. Coffee enemas it's controversial, but it's an interesting thing that people are doing and some seeing some good success with. Binders to help bind the toxins that are inside your body and flush them out. And then, then there's more advanced therapies like what you mentioned at CMS. There's a lot of things out there. I think you want to find what I call a mold literate doctor, a doctor that understands mold, knows how to test for it inside the body, and has good success with protocols. The interesting thing about the human body is every single person is different. So what might work for one person might not exactly work the same way for the next person. And so I think it's really, it's definitely your benefit to try things, ease into it, and see what works before you go all in.
Mm. And so you also discuss a bit about, the gut health and how it relates to mold. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah. So basically, mold definitely disrupts the microbiome of the gut. Essentially, what I think has to happen is I think it allows the elevation of specifically Candida. I can't tell you how many clients that I've had that I've asked, by the way, did you check for Candida?
Mm-hmm.
And they have an overgrowth of Candida. So it's very interesting. It totally disrupts the microbiome inside the gut, causes things like leaky gut, overgrowth of Candida, and just other imbalances, really.
Mm, I see. And also something about like how EMF or something also aggravates mold, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. There's a lot of studies out there that EMFs will accelerate mold. For instance, let's say mold is producing at 300 spores per cubic meter.
Mm.
With the introduction of EMF, that 300 spores per cubic meter can accelerate to as much as 600 spores per cubic meter, even more in some cases. We've also noticed that in these studies that the mycotoxin production is off the charts when you introduce EMFs. And I think basically we have to remember that because mold is a living organism, it does have self-defense mechanism, and its main job is to survive and to grow and colonize. And we obviously don't want it growing and colonizing and thriving in our homes, but that's what mold's objective is. And so EMFs can obviously impact humans, especially with certain sensitivities, but it threatens other organisms such as mold as well. And so when mold feels threatened, and there's EMFs and there's other things that we think could potentially threaten it, it'll start producing at a more rapid rate because it's means to survive, right? And when it feels threatened in that regard, it's going to pick up the pace.
Interesting. What are, some of the most important mold species that people should be looking out for?
Good question. So Stachybotrys shatarum, that is what, at least in the States, what the media has dubbed toxic black mold. I don't know if that has been advertised quite in the same way outside of the US, but I can surely tell you that's what they're talking about when they're referencing that. It's very misleading, by the way, because there's another toxic black mold called Chaetomium. They're very closely related. They're both toxigenic molds, and they both are prone to exist in chronic water leaks. There's typically not a mold that if you have a leak that dries up fast, that starts to grow. It's typically leaks that are ongoing that you don't realize are happening. And that can be behind the wall structure, right? You typically find that in kitchens and bathrooms, or basements, crawl spaces, even attics. I've seen it, but it's typically growing in areas that are more prone to wetness. Then you have the other two. I'll limit it to four molds that I see so much in buildings that cause such havoc. The other one is Aspergillus.
Yeah.
You had that one. Okay. So Aspergillus is an allergenic mold, and Cladosporium as well. And Aspergillus, the concern with that is it's a mycotoxin producing molds, just like Chaetomium and Stachybotrys. So even though it's not considered a toxic mold, it's capable of producing toxins, which by very definition are toxic. So I would still consider it a huge health threat because of that ability. And it also does produce, these allergenic symptoms, right? That the onset of a cold that never goes away, stuffy, runny nose, itchy, burning eyes. For instance, when I go to hotel rooms, because Aspergillus is one of the most common molds that are harmful that are almost everywhere. And so when I go to hotel rooms that have a high level of aspergillus inside the HVAC equipment, I will know it almost instantly. So I happen to be unfortunately allergic to cats. So the best way to describe it is when I walk into a hotel room that has aspergillus, I will feel like a cat is right on top of me. I get very itchy all over my neck, my face like this. My eyes start to turn red. I start to get itchy eyes. I mean, my throat starts to, get tighter and more swollen. I mean, it's like I instantly know, because it doesn't happen with any other mold. And so when I go, I instantly have to go back to the front desk and say, hey, I need to switch rooms. And usually they put me in a different room, and those symptoms, it's actually the second I leave the room, within 3 to 5 minutes, those symptoms start to subside. It's craziest thing. And that's, another confirmation and validation that I know of, like, okay, look, I know that if I'm going through this in certain parts when I'm exposed to it, and I couldn't imagine like living in that, luckily because of my knowledge, I've never lived in a moldy home in my adult life, because when I buy a home, I know to fix it the right way before I officially move in. And so I couldn't imagine a client living in that hotel room with those types of symptoms long-term. And some of these clients have been there, for months, just thinking, oh, I just have allergies. Oh, I just have, there must be high pollen out right now. It's the springtime. They think that there's just something else going on. What's interesting about allergies is allergies, by definition, it just means that you're having adverse reactions to a foreign substance entering the body. And mold is a foreign substance that enters the body.
I wanted to also ask a bit more about the symptoms. They seem to be so wide ranging when it comes to mold, but I wanted to hear a bit more about your experience and what are, some of the symptoms that you have seen, so people can have, more of an understanding of what the symptoms can look like when it comes to mold.
Yeah. So I have really, really insane stories. I have a client who, once she got exposed to mold, she had Epstein-Barr virus, I guess earlier in her life, quite possibly could have been exposed to mold at that time. We don't really know for sure. But after moving into a moldy home that she just bought, she started not feeling well again, went to the doctor, and after 20 years of not being exposed or having these symptoms, I should say, she then was diagnosed with reactivated Epstein-Barr virus. So it's very interesting, because I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done with Epstein-Barr virus, mold exposure, et cetera. One of the other things, and this is buried in the EPA's website, but basically that mold, the study with mold and asthma is very interesting. They're actually saying that it's possible that mold could create asthma, that it could be the lead cause of having asthma in the first place. What's interesting is as a child, I was in an apartment and I had an inhaler and I was diagnosed with acute asthma. And as soon as we moved into our house, went from New York to New Jersey and got a house in New Jersey, all of a sudden I no longer had to have an inhaler. I was told that my asthma no longer existed. So I got to see firsthand how that could be very true. And I think that obviously a lot more research needs to be done, but I think we need to look at those dots and see if there's a connection there. I've also, brain fog is probably the number one symptom that I get complained about as far as what they're experiencing. And it's just, and I'll talk to these clients and you can see that it's hard for them to string together words into a sentence. It's very, very interesting phenomenon that occurs here. And you'll be asking them questions and they'll be answering in midstream. They'll forgot what they were saying, have to pause. And I'd remind them as to where they're at so they can continue. It's a very bizarre thing. And I understand that brain fog is so much like a lot of other things, especially with considering the gut microbiome. There's a lot of connection there. It's one of those things that I know instantly, like I really understand where they're coming from. And I know that for sure mold exposure and the elimination of it will definitely set them on a path to healing. Because I've seen both sides of it. I've seen them come to me initially, and then I've seen them months later and how they feel months later. So it's really unique watching that transformation from, brain fog, and then start the healing. I had one client in particular that had a accent almost when I would talk to her. On days she went into the house, and I told her not to go into the house 100 times. And she would go into the house at the end of the workday and get, whatever she needed, or whatever she needed to get at the time. And she would call me and say, Michael, I went into the house. I know I shouldn't have gone into the house, but, I'm not really feeling well. And she had a totally different voice. To give it some perspective, it was like it was if you had an American person that you spoke to with a totally American accent, and then all of a sudden she had a British accent, and it's just like, I know you're not in Britain, right? Right now. So there was no explanation for that, other than the fact that she literally was so mentally debilitated. She talked, her entire speech was slurred, and it did not sound like her at all. So that's one of the many cases that I've observed where I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Mm-hmm. Then you have the chronic fatigue, where there has been times where I couldn't reach a client for 2-3 days. And I need clarity on something. I need to let them know that something has to be discarded, that it cannot be saved, right? And I can't get a hold of them for 2-3 days, and then they'll finally call me back and say, Michael, I'm sorry, I literally slept for like 2 days. I only woke up a couple of times in the middle of the night, and I didn't want to call you at that time, but I've been sleeping on and off. And it's like, wow, it can be really, really strangely debilitating. And obviously I'm giving you more extreme cases because not every case is that extreme, but I feel like it really highlights, the differences that people can go through in those regards and how extreme it can really be. Then you have the typical, I feel like I have a cold, but it never goes away. I feel like I'm allergic to my own house and my own belongings. I always am going through these allergy-like symptoms. These are a lot of the common effects: skin rashes, skin, very itchy, dry skin, things like that. I mean, those are probably the main complaints, which is challenging because there's so many other things that could be like that as well.
I can definitely speak for myself because I was constantly having to reach for words, and I had no idea what was happening with my memory. It was just such an absurd experience. And after moving out, I think around maybe 4 weeks later, everything kind of started to normalize. So
yeah, it's really crazy, and it's you notice such a degradation, and then you get out of it and you start to normalize and feel better. And, it's almost bizarre, right? Because we've never been educated that something like this can happen in the first place. So of course, for all of us, we're like, is something wrong with me? Am I thinking too much about this? Is this a mental, dysregulation, if you will? And so, I always tell clients like, nope, you're not crazy. You're in the right place. We're going to help you.
Yeah. And, I'm really grateful for all the work that you're doing as well, and all the awareness that you've been helping to raise. And I know that you've also set up a charity as well to help people.
Yes. So it's still not fully set up, but yeah, it's called the Healthy Home Foundation. We do have attorneys that are working on setting it up. It's a little more complex and takes a little longer than I would like. You would think a charity should be very easy to set up, but it's not. So we're hoping to have it within the next 30 to 60 days where we can then start funding for it. And what we want to do is we want to basically remediate homes for people that are underprivileged that cannot afford remediation on their own.
Yeah. And, I think I would love to share this in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Share it with everyone. I think it's really important. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak today as well.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me a platform to help continue to create that awareness, because if I don't have people that are connecting the dots that this is an important topic to discuss, then there's really no platform for me to continue to educate others. And so I want to thank you for, recognizing that this is an important thing, putting forth, this podcast. This is all amazing stuff, and it needs to happen because, as you know, this isn't just a problem in the US or Hong Kong for that matter. This is a global problem.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to listen today. And if you liked the episode, please remember to subscribe. And you can also find us at www.wellnessjourney.co